But yeah, really excited to have our, to kick off our second monthly Matt's Chats webinar series where we like to bring together supply chain experts, one from a 3PL, so Mark Ang, the CEO and co-founder of GoBolt, as well as a logistics technology company. So we have Ben Emmrich from Tusk Logistics, as well as a brand. So Rob Fraser, who's the CEO and founder of OUTWAY, which is a fantastic sock company based in Canada. There are 3 Canadians on this call, which I think is a really good thing. Mark, Rob, and myself. Ben is in Chicago, so it's basically, we share lakes and stuff, right? So you're pretty much a Canadian. But yeah, really excited for the next 40-ish minutes or so. We like to keep this, somewhat kind of informal, topical. We'll get started just by allowing the 3 panelists to give a brief intro on who they are and their companies. And then we have a couple questions, just to kind of get the juices flowing on shipping and the carrier ecosystem. And then we certainly want to leave a few minutes at the end for, an audience Q&A and hopefully get us out by, 12:45 Eastern-ish, 9:45 Pacific, whatever time zone you're in. So yeah, with that said, maybe we'll get started with some intros. We'll go Mark and then Rob and then Ben. So Mark, feel free to take it away.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for having us, Matt, and good to see everyone here. I'm Mark. I'm one of the founders and our CEO at GoBolt. We started the business back in 2017 before logistics became cool and sexy and all the VC money poured into it and everything got a bit nutty over the 2021 era. We operate our own warehouses, but we also have a last mile fleet that we think gives some of our customers an edge in speed and cost. And it's been a lot of fun building the business over the past 8 years, and we're excited for what's next.
Cool. Hey, everyone. My name is Rob. Founder, CEO of a brand called OUTWAY. We're a direct-to-consumer primarily, but omni-channel sock brand out of Canada. Founded the business just a year before Mark, I guess, in 2016, late 2016. So I've been selling socks for a while. Here to talk about every D2C founder's favorite thing, logistics and shipping and warehouses and 3PLs. But we've managed our own warehouse. We've had bad 3PLs, good 3PLs. And so, and now we're sold, all over North America, multi-channel. So quite complex logistics. So yeah, excited to be here and look forward to getting into it.
Hey everybody, my name is Ben Emmrich. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Tusk Logistics. So we are shipping infrastructure, and we exist to drive value to shippers of all types, 3PLs and brands, by giving them seamless access to alternative carriers nationwide. So those shippers use our technology to have full visibility into alternative carrier networks and full control over every parcel. So we cover over 70% of US population, and we are lucky to have good partners like GoBolt and by proxy, Rob's team at OUTWAY.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. We've had a few more join in the last couple of minutes. So there is a chat on the bottom there, kind of bottom center. Feel free to put in any questions that you have throughout. We might respond to some kind of in real time. Otherwise, we have a few minutes at the end to address as many of the questions as we can. But yeah, really excited for the 3 of you guys to be here today and talk shipping and carrier. So yeah, the first thing I wanted to discuss, maybe something a little bit more topical. Over the weekend, I read Pitney Bowes's parcel shipping index report, an annual report that they've been putting out for a number of years. I'm sure there's some folks on this call who have worked at Pitney Bowes in the past or have certainly used their products. I actually referenced it in my weekly newsletter, but there are some really interesting data points. And actually, Ben, I know that Tusk, I saw something this morning that you also put out a report on alternative carriers. I don't know if it's a quarterly report or an annual report, but I haven't quite had time to sift through it all, but I saw a few headlines. So excited to dig into that further. But the Pitney report was really fascinating. There were a couple specific data points that caught my eye. One of them was kind of discussing market share by revenue across different carriers. It also highlighted that Amazon Logistics, this is in Pitney Bowes' opinion, will overtake the Postal Service in 2028. So in just, let's call it 3 years from now, we'll actually be shipping more parcels per year than the US Postal Service. They're projecting Amazon Logistics to ship about 8.4 billion with a B parcels annually versus the Postal Service's 8.3 billion. So, I guess the point is there's a lot that's changing right now, in the carrier parcel space. UPS and FedEx and even USPS, have historically been the dominant three here in the United States. And it seems like alternative carriers, I don't know, Ben, if you consider Amazon Logistics an alternative carrier, or if they're in their own cohort, but we'll love your perspective on that. But the point is that other than those big three, historically, UPS, FedEx, and the Postal Service, there's been a lot of incumbents and, other carriers really, really taking market share and, have been really impressive. So curious, maybe, Ben, we'll start with you. What are your thoughts on, what's happening in the U.S. Parcel space right now?
Well, we have two shippers on the call, and so I would be curious to their thoughts as well. But in my mind, honestly, I see the changes that are occurring as a reflection of shippers hunting for value in the market. And like, you should not begrudge a shipper for switching their volume to different carriers if they can find more margin in final mile delivery. And so, Amazon is doing a really good job of selling a service that works well at a fair price, and they're investing in their infrastructure deeply, which is something that, I would argue the Postal Service cannot do at the same clip that they can. It is no surprise to me that Amazon is growing as fast as they are. Quite honestly, if they're serving shippers well and giving shippers value, like, more power to them, right? Like, what's best for shippers is best for our market. Matt, you mentioned the growth of alternative carriers. So, this is my space. This is a space we watch really closely. It's exploding. So alternative carriers have grown at a 34% compound annual growth rate for the last 3 years. That compares to like UPS and FedEx, which have grown at like low single digits, 1.1% over the last 3 years. It's no secret that alternative carriers are where the value is. The challenge is really like, if you're a shipping ops leader, like, what tools do you use to access those carriers? Do you negotiate with each one? Like, how does it work? How do you measure their performance? Those are all legit questions that these operators need to navigate. And folks like us exist for that. At the end of the day, the shippers need to trust those alternatives, and that growth rate will continue to explode with alternative carriers. So my guess is Amazon continues to grow, alternatives continue to grow. FedEx, UPS, and Postal will probably retrench in areas where they have more margin.
Amazon's growing obviously because they're just cannibalizing some of their own volume. They're farming out to carriers, particularly nationals, already. And there's an element of that. They obviously have the solution where they're selling it. I think they're trying to crack the code on some of the mid-mile elements, which is where I hear the quality is not amazing, just in the reliability and the mid-mile pickups and just the induction.
That's scanning. Hard for in their defense, Mark. That's hard for everybody.
Totally.
Mile is hard.
Yeah. What I think it's challenging from what I've heard, the brands that have gone on it, the particularly lower weighted shipments are being re-rated now at a higher rate. Like, we just helped one of our brands go through it to see if we're going to plug it in. Most of our carriers, including you guys, help us actually be cheaper, vis-a-vis Amazon shipping for like zones 1 to 7, 1 to 6. And so really like zones 7 and 8 are cheaper. And that's probably because they've just got so much capacity, whether it's planes or intermodal. Curious your thoughts.
What we see in pricing. So UPS and FedEx, if you think of them as the top of the market, we usually see Amazon rates come in, call it like 10% below a standard commercial rate with the UPS or a FedEx. So Good value. It's good. Then you see the regional carriers, another 10 to 15% below Amazon. So 20 to 25% below UPS and FedEx. And what we're now seeing is some of the emerging carriers pricing even at a deeper value. So when I say emerging, what I mean is folks like Uni, GoFo, SpeedX, DoorDash. These are, you call them emerging carriers. Some people call them metro carriers. Like, the value is there, the challenge is then like, okay, well, how do I get my stuff into a VHO dock in Philly and ORD and Dallas and LA and New York? It like the injects become a real pain. But like that's kind of the value stack. UPS and FedEx, Amazon, regionals, emerging carriers.
Rob, I believe you're a customer of GoBolt, a fulfillment customer of theirs. I believe Tusk Logistics is a supplier to GoBolt. So that's part of the relationship here. Rob, how do you think about, obviously as the customer of GoBolt, you have some pull in which carriers and services your 3PL uses to service your customers. What are some of the questions that you've been kind of thinking about to help kind of navigate the evolving carrier ecosystem?
Yeah, I think from a brand's perspective, we look at two things. We want the best price, but we want to meet a service kind of minimum to our customers. So we're always gauging, like what's the quality of the service of the carrier we're going to be providing. Because, if you're always going for the cheapest price, sometimes that's reflected in service as well. And that has the second order effects of customer complaints and issues. So there's going to be a cost on the back end of that too. So how we work with GoBolt, we've kind of said like, we want the lowest rate, but we want to meet these sort of service requirements, like this sort of lead time to get to the consumer. And they're always running that analysis for us and going through that. And on the like kind of alternative carrier just discussion in general, here in Canada, our postal service went on strike before Black Friday. So without them, without alternative carriers, packages weren't going out. So when we were managing our own warehouse, like our negotiated rates, we only really worked with Canada Post, like our national carrier. We would have been screwed. I don't even know what we would have done if we were doing it at the time because we weren't plugged in anything else, but it was seamless. Like not to be a commercial for GoBolt, and I'm sure this was with other 3PLs as well, but it was seamless. We were unaffected because they were also plugged into all the other kind of like alternative providers, even their own service. And our rates, I think, were the same. We were getting orders out and we were unaffected when I know other brands were just getting slammed. So I think, from a brand's perspective, we want more competition in the market. We want more coverage. We want better prices and we want better service, and competition does all of that. So I'm all for it. And honestly, getting off of postal service, in my opinion, especially in Canada, it's a monopoly. And so it drives prices up, it lowers competition, and it slows down service. So from a brand's perspective, we always want to see more. We want to see better. We want to see new entrants because margin's everything for us. And that's what we look for, but it's got to meet a certain service kind of standard for us because, the customer experience is first and foremost the most important thing for us.
That's great, Rob. Just a reminder, I'm not sure if others can post. You should be able to post in the chat. It at least goes to myself and the other panelists. So if you have any questions for Mark or Rob or Ben or in general, feel free to throw some questions in the chat here, and we'll get to them in a few minutes. I want to dive into GoBolt, the GoBolt and Tusk, partnership. As I mentioned a moment ago, GoBolt uses Tusk as one of their carrier networks, partners. I don't know how you can, vendors, suppliers, whatever.
Friends.
Yeah. I'm curious, like, how did it come to be? Mark, maybe this is more directed to you, but like, what sold you on the Tusk platform? Were you using alternative carriers before? I mean, I know you have obviously a big business in Canada as well as here in the United States. So, and candidly, I'm not as familiar with the carrier landscape in Canada, despite being Canadian. But it's been a while since I've lived there. Is Purolator still around? I know Canada Post, but I don't know what the regional carriers look like nowadays. But I'm just kind of curious. What sort of sold you on the Tusk platform? How are you using it today? Obviously, Rob is a customer with OUTWAY. Just kind of curious, given that GoBolt is a very modern, newer 3PL, very progressive, you've won a few clients that I've supported through the 3PL RFP process, and they've all been really happy. Just kind of curious, what were some of the triggers or variables that got you excited about what Ben is building over at Tusk?
Yeah, and I'll give some context because I think Ben tracked me down at a conference and hit me up at our booth. So that's how the relationship started. He made the first move, for the record, and then we took it from
You always
there.
have to go after what you want, guys. You have to go after what you want. You got to hunt them down.
Came in hot, and it was good because in Canada, we deliver, like, for many of our fulfillment clients and some of the large ones that we're implementing now, we cover like 80 to 90% of their parcel volume that we fulfill through our own parcel delivery network in Canada. So we kind of show up more like a national carrier here, because Canada, as Canadians, you kind of just like choose a few pockets. There's a few cool pockets to live in, like Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and then you kind of layer on like Edmonton, Calgary, Ottawa, and then you kind of have all 6 cities that matter. And we can deliver to all these cities ourselves. And we do that. And so we were kind of our own alternative carrier. We still have an alternative carrier network here in Canada, but it's much smaller than we have in the States, which we were blowing out in a bigger way a few years ago, kind of around the time Ben and I were meeting. And his platform just gives you a much better landscape where, API connections are a pain in the ass. And, you go into a queue and sometimes they're not compatible with what you're using as your intermediary and so on and so forth. And so Ben was just like equally a logistics nerd in his domain and had solutions to all these things and a platform and a vision that you could get behind. And then you've got a partner now that's just like thinking about that every single day when he wakes up, which makes it better for us, which makes it better for Rob and partners like him. And they've helped us too. Like we're not technically in, I think it's Easy Post. And Ben, I think your team, is it Ship Engine or Easy Post? Your team helped us.
Ship Engine.
So there's all these cartels where they charge you an arm and a leg as like a shipper, like as a carrier. They'll charge you like 10 to 20% rev share, which is like more than your margin, to be a service provider and serve up labels. And so you just have like price inflation. So Ben's already in that. So we kind of like snuck in through their API and are servicing one of our large transportation clients through them. So we kind of partner on a couple fronts, but initially met back then as part of our carrier diversification strategy in the States. And they've been a great partner.
Well, Mark, thank you above all else. The other cool thing that we've been able to do with the GoBolt team that we do with a lot of our 3PLs is really look at optimized injections, right? Because Mark's team is running a lot of freight, and they have to map out in their network where they're going to put that freight. So, Rob's socks are on a truck, and Mark's team needs to know where they're going to put Rob's socks to optimize for the lowest last mile delivery cost. We spend a lot of our time helping Mark's parcel team optimize for the injection location, the carrier, the service level, the timing, and we track the middle mile. We lower the cost on the transportation side. So it goes far beyond like the final mile parcel delivery rate. It's a lot about like optimizing the network, optimizing the injections, optimizing for time in transit and experience, not just lowest cost final mile delivery.
Ben, maybe talk to me a little bit about, I know there's a few brands on this call. I recognize some names, like, as well as 3PLs. How do you think about what your, I guess, typical customer looks like, or, how do I use Tusk? And, before you answer that, I know that, part of the benefit in working with a postal service or a FedEx or a UPS or even a DHL, maybe not e-commerce, but DHL Express, is that their minimum daily order volume is 1, right? I can ship a single parcel, I can have it picked up, or I can drop it off at a store or in a box, right? Or, collection box. It's really quite simple for SMBs to use, and really, really small SMBs to use. But I know one of the challenges that shippers have had with some of the alternative carriers, whether they're regional carriers or some of the couriers, I think Mark referenced them as metro couriers, or maybe that was Ben who said that. The Vihos of the world and the many others out there, is that if you're shipping 100 parcels a day, it's difficult to split that 4 or 5 or 6 ways, both operationally difficult, but also a lot of these carriers are unwilling to pick up if you just have 20 pieces, sitting on a pallet. So, how do you think about that, those dynamics, and is there like a minimum that Tusk is typically working with? Do you work with any self-fulfillers? I know there's a few on this call. Are you mostly working with 3PLs? Maybe speak to what that market looks like for you.
Yeah, good question. So our customers, the folks that use Tusk's infrastructure, are 3PLs and brands. Of our total volume, it's an 80-20 rule. Most of the volume on Tusk comes out of the 3PLs. So our typical shipper is a shipper that does at least $1 million in domestic spend per year. So domestic US spend per year. The average is far closer to like 15 to 20 million spent per year. We do not have minimums. What we do though is we have to charge for pickups. So the pickup cost ends up being kind of like the forcing function for that smaller shipper. Like if they're in the middle of nowhere, right? Like if they're in Hershey, PA, like it's hard for us to pick up 10 pieces or 5 pieces. Like the cost of that pickup is just not going to make sense. And so we often cannot serve that customer. If that same customer is in Santa Fe Springs, California, which is right next to a carrier hub injection of ours, and they're on the West Coast where we can offer free pickups, like, well, then I'm happy to pick up 2 pieces or 7 pieces or 700. So like we don't have minimums, but like it depends on where the facility is. I think like the bigger theme here, Matt, is shippers struggle with alternative carriers because it's complicated. And each time they negotiate direct and then have to integrate that single carrier into their operation, they're doing things like hitting a minimum for that carrier, which then they have to manage that. They have to manage a pickup at their dock door from that single carrier. Platforms like us allow all the alternatives to fight for the volume time. And then we do a unified dock sweep. So we're able to kind of like drive more volume, more density. And then the complexity is managed by Tusk with full visibility for the shipper, full control for the shipper. So it all depends on where they are, what volume they have, but we don't technically have minimums, especially on the West Coast.
That's great. And I think in the report this morning, you guys released, I think I saw Jake on your team post something on LinkedIn, and I think I posted in the chat here, so you guys can all click on that link there. I think Jake can mention that in the report, which I'll read shortly. I might be taking this a little out of context, but it was something to the effect of the on-time performance of alternative carriers is on par with the majors, right? The big boys and girls, the UPSs, the FedExes of the world. But they're also on the cost side, they're about a third less expensive, I think is the number I saw. Maybe it was 35%. So like, you're obviously biased, Ben, but you're also a good guy and an honest guy. Like, why wouldn't a shipper use an alternative carrier, right? Like if it's if it's better or on par performance and cheaper, like what's the gotcha?
Well, the gotcha is exactly what Rob said earlier. It's like, Rob, if you're comfortable sharing it, what's the range of your like cost of acquisition for a customer roughly?
It can be upwards of $40 a customer.
All right, so Rob goes out in the market and he spends $40 to $50 to get a customer. That customer buys a $20 order of socks from Rob. They buy that once a month, once a quarter, something like that. Rob's biggest risk is that he rolls the dice on an alternative carrier, and that alternative carrier throws Rob's socks over the fence, and that customer's dog eats them up before they hit the front door. And that customer is pissed. That customer, they don't give a shit that it was the alternative carrier. They're going to go to Rob, right? And Rob's going to run the risk of not only losing that $40 he spent to acquire that customer, but all those future orders they would have given to him had they had a good experience. So it's this perception of risk outweighs the value, the margin that a Rob could gain from alternatives. Now, that perception of risk is incorrect. The alternative carriers are great. The alternative carriers that we have on Tusk are better than great. Like their on-time percentage, even in a holiday week, was approaching 95%. On a normal week, it's like 96, 97%. They offer insurance on every parcel. Like that's the reality, that's the truth, but the perception of risk is shaped by the old school kind of like older stories about bad experiences with alternative carriers, which is no longer the truth. Now the market has to catch up. And the reality is like people are untrusting of alternatives carriers today. And quite honestly, it's like my job, my mission as a company and as an individual founder to build that trust. Like I have to have a Rob think to himself, like, okay, this is worth a change, right? Like it's worth me picking up this margin because I know that the carrier is good and I know I have the tools to manage it day to day.
Yeah,
Mark,
I
what do
mean,
you
Ben,
think? Like 3PLs face the same sense of like risk versus reward.
Yep. Yeah, because
Like how did you guys balance that?
Yeah, because the feedback loop comes back usually to the fulfillment shop on like, why did you select this carrier for this? So when Rob gets an angry note, it gets forwarded to our team, and then we're like, holy shit, and that's where we need to be judicious with what we test. Now, I met a shipper that does 140,000 orders a day, and we're scoping out Miami, LA, and New York deliveries for them. And they're like, for 20 years, we just haven't like thought about alternatives. This is the first time we're going to do it. They want to like tour our facility, observe like multiple sorts to just get confidence, observe a loadout, do a ride. Like the amount of due diligence is more than we've ever had for Fortune 50 companies that we work with. And it's just because they're so, I think, timid, because they also have to answer to some folks on their end, right? Now, you need to be careful because we were presented with a rate that started with a 1 in New York for delivery. And New York's an area that we deliver to, so we know what the underlying cost is to sort, pick up, and actually deliver that package properly. And we know they were losing like many dollars per shipment to do that. And so alternatives, because they're often venture-backed, are usually not doing the math, and they're just looking at growth. And that's a huge problem. And like I think the substrate of this is that a lot of small alternative carriers are going out of business and are still losing money, even though you think they're actually quite large. Like one of the large ones that we've mentioned on this call has a negative gross margin, i.e., they could fire all their overhead and still be out of business when the bank balance runs dry. And so that's a fair concern. And I think you just need to like start to work with businesses like Tusk and like dip your toes in those waters and go deeper, and you'll get more comfort. But we are like traveling. We probably work with 12 to 15 carriers, I would say, as a business, which is a lot. And I think like most people only work with like 1 or 2. And so I think there's an opportunity to diversify for sure.
Rob, as a brand, as a shipper, obviously shipping is a big expense for your business. Generally, I find that it's about 2/3 of your logistics spend is the small parcel shipping. Maybe for you, it's a little bit less, given that you're shipping socks and not anything that's heavier. But yeah, I'm curious, if you're willing to share, like how big of a driver was the carrier network or diversification that GoBolt has, and sort of making this decision. I mean, I say that with the context that I know more than a handful of 3PLs that are, they're only UPS or they're only FedEx, right? And to implement a new carrier takes 4 months or 6 months maybe, and tens of thousands of dollars of implementation costs. So I'm just curious, to get your perspective on how important as a brand using a broader ecosystem of carriers is to you.
It's super important. We sell socks, so thankfully our AOV is not $20, but it is a low AOV business. So our average order is sub $100, meaning that especially in Canada, but also in the US, I mean, when you're looking at the rates of the 3PL plus the shipping costs, you're looking at 10 to 20% of revenue just in shipping as an expense, which is substantial. So when we're looking at everything, and obviously the biggest cost center of that whole equation and just the logistics part is the shipping rate. the carrier rate, it's incredibly important that we're getting the best price, because like every dollar or even cent we can save on gross margin allows us to do so much more, whether it's acquiring customers or building our team or just being more profitable. Little movements in our gross margin are like the name of the game in the direct to consumer brand, and increasing gross margin so you have more contribution margin to grow is literally the formula. So for us, shipping is one of the biggest expenses in the gross margin line. There's a debate of whether or not you put shipping above or below the gross margin line, but we put it above. So um, that's incredibly important to us. And considering that, the parcel the shipping cost is the biggest part of that equation, when going with GoBolt or anyone else, we're looking at, yeah, who can on the fly figure out what's going to be the best rate when an order comes through and meet our service requirement and do that. Because every time that we can improve the margins there or find ways to optimize, we make more money, or we can acquire more customers, we can grow faster. So it is, we're opening with GoBolt in LA, and I guess next month. And it wasn't a for sure thing that we were going to use them. We use them in Canada because I think they're the best in Canada. The US is a much bigger market, so we went through a full RFP process and ended up going with GoBolt because they're able to meet where we want. But the biggest consideration there is like, how can we make the margins work? That is the most important thing for us, because our product and supply chain is as optimized as possible. We can't really move the margin down there. Shipping is where we can still toggle a little bit, and so it's just incredibly important.
And Rob's probably one of the more sophisticated founders in the D2C space by focusing on the dollars and cents. I think most D2C founders who get to 8 figures of revenue are in that camp and track this maniacally. And then for us, it's about, all Rob cares about is like, my average shipping cost is X. Like underneath that, he doesn't need to worry about that. That's what we're here to do. And if we can figure out ways to use our warehouse network, which, spans 6 markets in the States, our air skip capabilities, our last mile, mixed with the folks like that, we don't cover 70% of the market. Like we need Ben's tech to do that. But for major metro centers, we can naturally reduce our partners' costs because we can get it there ourselves and then deliver it ourselves. And that's been important for high velocity shippers. They then expect something to look very similar to our cost for those major metros, and we can't do that with a national. And then in comes our partnership with Tusk, where we can. And so that's sort of how it all works for us on the back end.
I'd also say too, guys, like one thing that's emerging from our perspective is this shift. So call it 2010, a shift occurred where shippers went from having exclusive contracts with FedEx, UPS, or the Postal Service to moving to a multi-carrier ecosystem. But multi-carrier really was like 5 carriers or less. So it was usually FedEx or UPS, usually a postal consolidator like a DHL Ecom, OSM, Pitney Bowes, etc., and then maybe the Postal Service directly. And so 5 carriers or less, and they were optimizing amongst them in their TMS. What you're now seeing is the best-in-class shippers look a lot like GoBolt. So Mark, you mentioned 15 carriers. Like that is best in class today. Now that requires you to have the bandwidth on your team, the tooling, the expertise, the facilities. But like that shift towards a best carrier optimization, meaning like the best carrier across a wide carrier set for every single parcel to find the value, the margin that Rob needs, that's best in class right now. And more people need to move in that direction because they're not seeing the value anymore from just having, call it, a handful of carriers enabled in their building.
Yeah. Yeah, Nick in the chat's commenting about like tracking experience for alternative carriers. Like this is an area where it gets dicey. Like some people like to use, let's say, like Aftership, and you need to integrate to that nicely to provide a seamless tracking experience. A lot of like the larger brands will do that to consolidate performance data, et cetera. And you kind of need to conform to that or not. There's a brand that, due to their WMS limitations, can only integrate with one carrier. And I'm like, okay, well, that carrier just went on strike. So now what? So like they need like a unified API to just get one single pathway for a label, kind of like what Ben Software does. But it's kind of a mixed bag. And because of like larger businesses have usually gone to enterprise grade systems, you now need the smaller carrier to like step up and chin up to like integrate to that. And that I've found is a limitation. Like even for us, like I said, we use like the Tusk backdoor to get into Ship Engine. because there's a queue of like 200 people to do it, and like $100,000 pay to play plus a 10 to 20% rev share like makes no sense for us to do that. So those things like will continue to be an issue, but there are plenty of other alternative carriers that you can lean on that already have solved that.
Nick, this is such a good question about tracking. One really good example. So Mark mentioned it, Aftership, or there's Parcel Perform or Wondermint, which just got bought by Loop. Like that's a one really easy solution. So like Tusk is live on those. So we cover all the alternative carriers. So we can enable the alternative carriers on those post-purchase tracking platforms. We're also like building a Shopify app so that like a big pain point right now is some of these biggest alternative carriers, Uni, VHO, etc. You can't pass a VHO tracking number to Shopify. They just don't recognize it. They mismap it. It gets mapped to like a random European carrier if it's even recognized at all. So we're building a Tusk Shopify apps to act as a switchboard, basically like an automated mapping that gets passed via Shopify's metadata so that the customer, Rob's customer, can see full tracking updates regardless of alternative carrier. But like the ecosystem, the tooling, the infrastructure has had to catch up to this. So the tracking piece is incredibly, incredibly important and incredibly difficult.
Matt, you're on mute.
I am. We have about 5 minutes here. I'm going to just hit on Jennifer's question quickly, but if anyone else has a question, feel free to put it in the chat here. And we should be able to get to one or two others. But and I know, Ben, you sort of touched on this as well, but I know there's a perception of UPS and FedEx have, at least historically, but I would argue still to this day, are certainly perceived as a more premium offering. They're, depending on the exact model, their employees, they wear their uniforms, they drive in the branded trucks. They have stores where you can go to and talk to someone, pick up a package, for what it's worth versus, my wife, she gets a couple, orders from a couple brands that get delivered by alternative carriers on a weekly or monthly basis. Companies like Sakara Life, the meal kit gets delivered by VHO every Sunday. So I see them. Often it's, the person is wearing an Amazon vest because they are also delivering Amazon packages while they're delivering VHO packages for Sakara Life, among others. I know Lululemon and Rent the Runway and a few other shippers like that use, some of these alternative carriers, which is great. But I think the perception is still that they are just not as premium. And I wonder if customers care about that, right? Like I remember years ago, when I was living on the West Coast and OnTrack was only on the West Coast, you would never, order from a customer, from a brand who used OnTrack because the person delivering it would show up in a beat up 4-door sedan, with their family in the car. And there's part of me that's like, why the hell do I care, right? As long as I get my order, right? I mean, if they're, doing it that way, that's fine. So I'm curious, maybe this is more from like the brand perspective, Rob, but like, do you see like any elevated customer experience complaints or concerns when packages are delivered with certain carriers that are not UPS or FedEx? Or like, is it mostly like just deliver it in a reasonable amount of time and you're probably not home anyways when the person delivers it, unless you stock your Ring camera like I sometimes have the tendency of doing. Like, you don't know who delivers it, right? Whether it's your letter carrier or otherwise. So curious really quickly, what you hear from your customers' perspective.
I think generally, if you're meeting the expectations, they don't care. The only time we hear from our customers about deliveries is when they don't show up or they're late. And I think like maybe there's a pricing consideration. I'd even think of my own consumer behavior. Like perhaps if I'm buying a $10,000 bike online, I want to see a brand name. So I think there's still a trust factor that's always going to play in. But I think generally, so many people, if you think about from COVID onwards, so many people buy things online now, and they come from so many different places, so many different ways, specifically Amazon. that I think we've been conditioned to not care if it's a brand name delivering anymore. Like we really just don't care. I think the consumer is very blind to it. If you think about like when people started buying things online in general, people were very skeptical of putting their credit card details, and now you don't think twice. So I think over time these things just become the new normal, and I think we've definitely seen a shift into people expect it to be, for lack of a better term, like the Amazonification of it. Like it's not a brand name. It's some guy coming in a van that you might not be branded. Like they don't care generally as long as it's meeting the expectation. I think perhaps where the brand name still makes sense, like I said, is maybe on a high value purchase. But even then, that's sometimes coming freight, and that is a different way. And so there's just all these different ways that things are being delivered. And maybe Mark or Ben have some insight on this. But from the brand's perspective, we never get customer complaints because it wasn't a FedEx or a UPS or Canada Post.
Yeah, I would echo that. We have a brand that they're going to be shipping 30,000 orders a day moving into one of our Toronto sites. And they're like, we're going to start with this national, like a FedEx brand or a UPS. And then we're going to diversify later because we want to build trust in the market. Though we think that's outdated, the clear shift is to then move away from it afterwards, where they just don't want their brand name to be associated with someone that's also unknown. And we hear that like every now and again, but it's not really prevalent. The general consensus is what Rob's saying. I mean, when ATMs were invented, everyone thought tellers would go away. In fact, there were more tellers that came over the next 30, 40 years than not. And so I think it's just a change management thing. The best alternatives, carriers, there's still a big delta with the worst ones, though. So you can't just go blindly choose an alternative carrier. There is a gradient scale on performance and quality. And I think, Ben, you probably see that every day with your data, but you still need to be smart about it. The nice thing with the nationals, there's only really two choices to make. And so that's pretty easy. The rest requires due diligence and going deep.
Go ahead, Ben.
Due diligence and control, right? Like shippers of all types need to be able to see performance of alternative carriers in real time. And they need to be able to turn carriers on, turn them off when they're not performing. And like traditionally, that has been really difficult to do at scale. Like you don't see about a parcel issue until Rob's customer calls in and says, hey, Rob, like my dog ate my socks, right? Because the guy threw it over the fence. So like having that layer of visibility of proactively fixing delivery issues, that's something that hasn't existed for alternatives until now. Like the ecosystem is being built, the infrastructure is being built, and it allows people to ensure the level of service that they require, which is often higher than FedEx or UPS.
I'll just touch on one thing because Marcus brought it up just to append onto what I was saying is the only time we have seen customer complaints with the alternatives is like maybe poor tracking or online tracking. We've kind of already addressed this and how they could be aggregated into certain services, and that's getting better. But in the past, before the alternatives have gotten better technically, customer just not being able to track their order along the way has been maybe sometimes the only complaint. But if it shows up on time, they don't have complaints typically. Awesome.
Well, gentlemen and attendees, we're out of time here. I posted a couple chats ago, everyone's contact information, Mark's, Ben's, and Rob's, and myself. We have been recording this, so I believe we should be sharing it tomorrow. You'll get an email if you missed it. Feel free to hit up Mark or Ben or Rob via email, LinkedIn. I know they're all fairly active there. Thanks everyone for joining. Our next one, I think we're doing these the second Wednesday of the month. So the next one will be August 13th. We'll send more information as we get closer, but thanks everyone for spending some time this morning or this afternoon. Have a great rest of the week. And thank you, Mark, Ben, and Rob for joining us.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everybody.